And so I'm going to speak about this book that came out in 2013. And it's about Virginia. In particular, it's about slavery and how enslaved people affect war and how war affects enslaved people. It looks a little bit at the American Revolution, but mostly it looks at the War of 1812. And the War of 1812 is a war that gets less attention, certainly less than the Revolution or less than the Civil War of the 1860s. But the War of 1812 is very revealing of the nature of slavery. And it's revealing because British warships were operating in Chesapeake Bay and were interacting with enslaved people. And in the course of the war, they would help about 5,000 enslaved people to escape to freedom with the British. So the story that I tell in The Internal Enemy, and the phrase internal enemy is something that was used by Virginians in the early 19th century, including during the War of 1812. And it reflected their anxiety that when they're attacked from the outside, when they're attacked by the British coming in from the Atlantic, that they would have to fight a two-front war. That white Virginians would risk that their own enslaved people, and enslaved people were approximately 40% of the population of Virginia in 1812. And in many counties, they were a majority. So particularly along the Tidewater. Culpeper's in the Piedmont region, and probably a little below 50% of the population of Culpeper would be enslaved people. Whereas if you went into Western Virginia, which was then part of Virginia, you'd find much smaller numbers, 10 to 15% or lower. So there's considerable gradation between the concentration of enslaved people along the Tidewater, in the Piedmont, and then many fewer in the interior. So the book is about what happens when war comes into the midst of a society which is committed to a form of property that includes owning human beings. The Chesapeake Bay is kind of a dagger pointed into the heartland of the United States. The war began when the United States declared it on the British. The United States leaders and the majority of Americans were very upset with how the British were conducting their naval dominance. Britain was involved in a war against Napoleon. Napoleon, as of 1812, had occupied almost all of Europe and was about to launch his invasion of Russia. So Napoleon's at the peak of his power, and the sole primary adversary that Napoleon faces is the British Empire. While Napoleon's forces are superior on land, the British Empire has the largest and most powerful and best conducted navy in the world. And it was exercising that naval power to interfere with neutral shipping that was attempting to deliver cargoes to Napoleon's Europe. And the United States was a neutral country and is the primary neutral country engaged in maritime commerce. Second only to Britain in the world, but Britain, of course, is a belligerent power against Napoleon, whereas the United States is neutral and is exploiting that situation for the profit of American merchants and sailors and the shippers of American cargoes. So the British start messing around with this. They start stopping American ships, taking American sailors off of these ships and putting them to work in the Royal Navy, something called impressment. And eventually Americans become upset by this and they declare war. But the British regard this as a sucker punch because they've got their hands full fighting Napoleon. They think of Napoleon as a dictator. They think of themselves as defending freedom in the world. So why would the United States attack them while Britain was doing what they saw as good in the world by fighting Napoleon? Now, Britain, because of its naval supremacy, is able to send warships up into Chesapeake Bay, and the Chesapeake Bay receives all these navigable rivers like the Rappahannock and the Potomac and the James, and it extends all the way up into southern Pennsylvania So if you have naval supremacy and you can send your warships in there, you can use that position to attack the villages and the farms and the plantations up these rivers and along the shores of the bay. And Virginia is the largest state in the Union. It is the richest state in the Union. And it has the most people in the Union as of 1812. And the leaders of the United States are heavily from Virginia, including the President of the United States at that time, James Madison, who had succeeded another Virginian, Thomas Jefferson. And the Secretary of State is James Monroe, another Virginian, who will succeed James Madison in 1816. So the British think, sticking it to Virginia is the best way to stick it to the whole United States. And the British are very upset at the Americans for declaring this war. So the war against the Americans is a sideshow for the British. It's not the main operation. Most of their forces are in Europe or they're in India. And the British wish they didn't have this war. But if they are going to have this war with the Americans, they want to maximize the economic pain they can inflict on Americans in hopes of persuading the American leadership to pull out of the war. So that's the whole British goal. It's not to conquer the United States. It's to get out of the war as fast as possible. And their calculation is the way to do it is to inflict a lot of economic pain so that the Madison administration will negotiate a quick peace. Now, just a few images to set the scene in Virginia. We're very familiar with these large mansions that survived from the colonial period or the early Republic period, places like Monticello in Charlottesville, or Montpelier in Orange County. But much more standard is plantations that look like this one. This is a watercolor done in the 1790s by a British visitor, and it's called Ripon Lodge. And you can see that this is a lot of scattered low buildings made out of wood. And it's in farms and plantations that look like this that most enslaved people live and work. This is much more typical of the Virginia landscape than the grand mansions. It's just the grand mansions, because they're built out of brick usually, they survive. Whereas these smaller scattered wooden buildings have largely rotted away. So it creates a false impression of what the past looked like in Virginia in 1812. And most enslaved people didn't live in hundreds or even dozens. They lived a handful on a given property, a farm or a small plantation. That's much more typical. So there's a gradation. There are these large operations like Monticello that would have a couple of hundred enslaved people working at them, but much more common is these smaller farms and plantations like Ripon Lodge. Enslaved people, men and women, work in the fields. The same artist who produced the preceding image also made this one, and it's called An Overseer at His Duty. It's from 1798. And it's a kind of a satirical presentation. It's a real scene that he saw. The overseer is employed by the master of this plantation to supervise his workforce. Well, this particular overseer is smoking a cigar and leaning on a cane and really not doing very much, while these two enslaved African-American women are working very hard, hoeing up between these stumps. And one of the chief pressures on enslaved people in the years before the War of 1812 is that they're considered valuable commodities. They're bought and sold on the market. And this includes men, women, and children. And masters were not bashful about selling wives away from their husbands or children away from their parents. And that is increasing during these years, particularly after 1808, when the United States bans the import slave trade from Africa. Meanwhile, the cotton growing states of the Deep South, places like South Carolina and Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi and Tennessee, they're dramatically expanding their cotton operations because there's a growing demand in the world for cotton, and cotton prices are good. There's great land. It's better growing season, longer growing season for growing cotton than Virginia is. So Virginia in many ways is stagnating economically. At the same time, while the Deep South is booming. Now, in 1790, half of the enslaved people in the United States lived in the single state of Virginia. Virginia's a big state, and it's had a slave system for a very long time, back to 1619. So many Virginians felt they had a surplus of enslaved people, more than they could employ profitably, but what they could do is sell them to the Deep South. And so thousands upon thousands of people are being herded in chains to the Deep South for sale. And this particular image is done by a critic of slavery, a guy from Maryland, and it represents an episode in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. was a primary market for enslaved people being relocated from Maryland and Virginia to the Deep South. They'd be brought there, they'd be organized into groups, and then march south. And this particular woman was held up in the garret of a tavern, and she tried to escape by jumping out the window. And what she did, she paralyzed herself. So she's of no value then to the people who had bought her, and they just left her behind. But they took her 2 children away and sold them to the Deep South. So it's a lot of tragedies like this that are happening to enslaved people. And it creates an incentive for people to try to get away if they can. Now, the escaping was very difficult. It was easy to get away from your particular plantation or farm, but making it all the way to the north is not really providing much safety because there are fugitive slave laws that require northern states to return enslaved people to the south. And there's bounty hunters with dogs that pursue people. So it can be very difficult to get away, particularly if you want to get away with your whole family. Now, here's an image that shows how Virginians kind of thought about slavery and war. It's an image representing an episode from the American Revolution. A very large and powerful man named Peter Francisco, who was a blacksmith, is the man wielding the saber. And you can see him here fighting off an entire troop of British cavalrymen. And meanwhile, in the background, you see a couple of African Americans who are slinking back. And so this is kind of a wishful thinking. I mean, the Peter Francisco episode seems to have happened, probably didn't involve as many British troops as are shown here. But this is an image, it's not a photograph. It shows what white Virginians wanted to believe, which is that a single white Virginian could fight off an entire British troop and maintain control over enslaved people, that enslaved people were considered rather cowardly. That's wishful thinking. I'm not describing accuracy there. It's revealing that this image was produced in 1814 during the War of 1812 in Virginia. So it's kind of a rallying cry image to rally Virginians to fight off the British in order to preserve their property system. This is another image produced at the time. This shows a proposed telegraph system. Now, not the electric telegraph that would later be developed, but a visual telegraph. And these kinds of systems were used in Europe at the time. Napoleon had developed such a system. And a military engineer proposed to the governor of Virginia that they should set one up at the start of the War of 1812. And you would set up these stations a few miles apart. And it's like a semaphore. So each one of these semaphore stations would put up this visual image, and then a few miles away, the next station would see that image and would put up the same one. And you could extend a simple message in this visual way over many miles if you built these stations. And so the proposal is very interesting in that it shows a variety of perceived potential enemies over in the key on the left. And one of them you can see is called Negro. So this system would not only enable you to report if the English were invading, or the Russians even, but also if there is a slave revolt. And so this very system then that's proposed, never built, but it shows the fear that Virginians have of a slave revolt being initiated by the British, in which they would encourage enslaved people to throw down their tools, leave their homes, kill their masters, run away, join the British, organize into military units, and fight for their freedom. But at the start of the war, while Virginians are fearful that this is what the British are up to, British commanders are actually under orders not to do that. And in part, it's because British leadership in London thinks that they don't need to do it to bring the United States to negotiate a quick and favorable peace. They think just attacking American shipping and American seaports and farms and plantations near the water will suffice. And they're kind of fearful that they had encouraged a lot of enslaved people to run away during the American Revolution, and then had relocated them to Nova Scotia and New Brunswick and the Bahamas. And it had cost British taxpayers a lot of money. So the British government says, we don't want to do that again. We don't want to have a large and expensive refugee population. So the instructions to this man, Alexander Cochrane, who is the naval commander in the North Atlantic waters, is you can go into places like Chesapeake Bay and you can recruit a few African Americans who can be useful to you as pilots, as guides, and you can promise them freedom, but you got to keep the numbers way down. No encouraging mass escapes. But very large numbers of African Americans start to steal dugout canoes. And dugout canoes were the primary way in which people got around in the tidewater. Roads were terrible. Farms and plantations are along creeks and streams and rivers, and all of them have these dugout canoes. And enslaved people were used to using them. They were sent up with messages or sent to work on another property in these canoes, or they were sent out fishing or crabbing. So they're familiar with how to use these, and they start grabbing them and putting entire families on them to escape. And they would paddle off to British warships and say, you're the enemy of our enemy, we want to join you. Well, this puts these British naval officers on the spot. What are they to do? They've got orders not to take these people in, but they know that if they turn them away and they go back, that they're going to face very severe punishment. And British naval officers are kind of intrigued by all of these runaways coming to them, because they're shorthanded in their crews and in the Marines who serve on these warships. They have a desertion problem. The white sailors on these ships are from Ireland and Scotland and England, and they've heard that life in the United States is better than being on a British warship, that you get higher pay, and cost of living is lower. So the reputation of the United States as a prosperous place for immigrants was something that was appealing to a fair number of these British Marines and sailors. And they're sent on these raids onto the shore, and some of them will start running away. So these warships, the British warships, are shorthanded. So there's a temptation to say, well, we're losing people running away to the Americans. Why shouldn't we welcome the people running away from the Americans in order to give us some more manpower? And then there's also the consideration that the British are kind of fed up with the Americans boasting about their liberty, about being so freedom-loving. And they say, well, if you're so freedom-loving, why do you have so many slaves? So by welcoming runaway slaves and putting them to work in the British Navy, they're gaining manpower, and they're also trying to win a propaganda battle by saying, no, the British are the real champions of freedom in the world, not the Americans. And they know that these runaway enslaved people are very valuable forms of property in Virginia and Maryland. And so they're inflicting economic pain, which is their charge, is to do as much as you can. So British naval commanders like Alexander Cochrane are writing to their home government saying, we really don't like turning these people away. We think you ought to let us welcome them and recruit them. And in 1814, very early 1814, the British government says, okay, we'll follow your advice. The war's dragged on. The quick end to the war that the British had hoped for didn't happen. And so the British say, we're going to up the pressure on the United States, and we're going to encourage these runaways. And so the policy shifts all around. It becomes, okay, now in your raids, your primary goal is to recruit as many African Americans as possible, to encourage as many to run away as possible. Quite a difference from what the original instructions were. And this happened primarily because African Americans, through their own initiative, have put the pressure on the British by escaping to their warships and demanding to be taken on board and to be used in the war to fight their mutual enemy. So the British established a base in 1814 on Tangier Island. Tangier Island had a very small population, and there were no fortifications there until the British moved in and started building fortifications, and they built an encampment. Here is a modern artist's attempt to imagine what the scene looked like, the sort of log cabins that are built. And it shows the drilling of African-American recruits in a special unit called the Colonial Marines. And several hundred are recruited from the several thousand refugees. Now, the refugees are men, women, and children. So these are some of them older men, older women. So the younger men, the able-bodied men, most of them are recruited into the Colonial Marines. Others join work crews that work building fortifications at Tangier Island, and others are relocated to Bermuda, where they work in the naval dockyard there. And some become sailors. All of them are paid. They are receiving better food, better pay, well, they're receiving pay, and better clothing than they've ever had. And then they're sent on these raids onto the mainland, and other African Americans who are being held in rags and often hungry would see them and would think that looks like a better life. So the Colonial Marines are not only effective in combat, they're effective as recruiters of other enslaved people to escape. Initially, some of the British naval officers, while they wanted to encourage slaves to run away, they had racial prejudices too, and they thought, well, they won't be such good fighters. But they end up surprising the British because they're not going to desert these men. And they have a lot of resentment toward their former masters. They don't want to be captured. So they'll fight like hell. And they become the most effective Marines that the British have in this Chesapeake Bay operation. Now, the man who really comes around on them is the #2 in command of this Chesapeake operation. Admiral Cochrane is usually elsewhere, operating, for example, along the coast of New York or off Delaware. And so the guy who's really in charge in the Chesapeake is this man, Admiral George Coburn. And Coburn becomes a real enthusiast for African-American recruits into the Colonial Marines when he sees how effective they are. And they're effective not only because they fight very well and won't desert, but also because they know the lay of the land. They know paths through the woods. They know where the streams are. They know where the farms and plantations are located that have a lot of extra livestock and other food, and storehouses of tobacco. So because of their knowledge of the land, they enabled the British raiding operations to become far more effective and to penetrate deeper inland. Before they recruited large numbers of Colonial Marines, the British were very hesitant to go into the interior, to go out of sight of their warships, because they were fearful of being ambushed. Because they didn't know the country so well, and they knew that Americans were very good at setting ambushes. But after the Colonial Marines are organized and deployed, the British become better at setting ambushes and at learning where American militia forces are encamped and surprising them. So the war turns around for the British in the Chesapeake, but very limited effectiveness in 1813, but it becomes much more effective in 1814. And they were operating largely in smaller craft like this. So from their warships or from Tangier Island, they are venturing in these smaller boats that can go further up rivers and streams, and landing and then raiding farms and plantations. And they're not only trying to inflict damage on these places and to recruit African Americans, but they're also trying to get food. Because British forces on these ships, they don't have enough food, and they don't want to be shipping it across the Atlantic. And as they're recruiting more people, more of these Colonial Marines who can't be raising their own food, they're busy fighting, and they've got families that also need to be fed. So the British need to get a lot more food. And so they're looking for farms and plantations that have surplus food that can be grabbed and brought to Tangier Island and brought to these warships operating in Chesapeake Bay. Now, this is a modern map that shows one of the operations up in Kent County, Maryland. And the red lines show how British forces are doing these attempts to kind of attract militia forces closer to the shore and then go and surprise them by slipping in behind. And they ended up attacking this American camp at Coxfield and taking it by surprise and dispersing the militia. So what the British are doing during 1814 is they're greatly escalating their raids. And they're going farther inland. And they're trying to demoralize the militia. Let me just explain a bit what the militia were. They're not professional soldiers. The United States had sent most of its professional soldiers northward to invade Canada, which was in British hands at the time. And they rely then on militias to defend the coast. Militias are just your ordinary white guys. They're farmers and blacksmiths and carpenters and shoemakers. They're not professional soldiers. They have very little training, but they are expected to have firearms. And in emergencies, they're called into service. They're not well trained. Their morale is not particularly good because most of them would rather just be at home and at work. But what the British think is we got to break these militias up by attacking some of them, demoralizing the rest, sending out the message that you ought to just stay home and surrender to us and we'll parole you. Parole means you go home and you're not allowed to fight anymore until you're exchanged for a prisoner of war taken by the other side. Well, the Americans aren't taking many prisoners during the War of 1812. And while the British find that there are thousands of militiamen who decide, discretion's a better part of valor, and they should surrender and get a parole, and that's like a get out of the militia card. They get to go home and run their farms and their shops and protect their families from there. And so the British are trying to break up the militia in Maryland in particular, but also in Northern Virginia. And they have more success in Maryland than they do in Virginia. British operations, here's another modern artist's depiction of the role of the Colonial Marines. This is a raid on Benedict, Maryland. A British officer in blue in the background is directing African Americans to waiting boats to take them away to British warships. A small American merchant ship's burning in the background. And then Colonial Marines are in the foreground, and they are bringing hogsheads filled with liquor, and they're setting them on fire, along, in some cases, with tobacco. So again, trying to inflict economic pain on the United States. And it shows the Colonial Marines are very active in this. This map shows the difference between operations in 1813, which you see on the left, and British operations in 1814. Everywhere you see an image of something burning or of a ship, that shows a British raid. You can see that in 1814, a lot more raids than in 1813, and much more concentrated in southern Maryland, along the Patuxent River Valley and in the Potomac. And you can say, well, why are the British suddenly targeting those areas? Well, that's why they're trying to break down the militia, because the militia, while not particularly effective in combat, it's a good early warning system if they're attacked. So they're trying to break that down, because the target for British operations, the ultimate target, there are two of them. One is Washington, D.C., and the other is Baltimore. So they're trying to soften up and eliminate militia resistance and recruit as many African Americans as possible, build up the Colonial Marines, and then when they're ready, they're going to make the main strike up either the Patuxent or the Potomac, and it turns out they do both, in order to get at Washington, D.C. And they capture Washington, D.C. They don't burn the whole city, but they burn the public buildings, including the White House, which is represented on the left, and in the background is the Capitol. It's not an accurate picture. The Capitol and the White House are much more distant, but this is the British trying to, it's a British image, and it's meant to show just how powerful they are. What's interesting is all the faces of the British force here are white, and the reality is that a significant number, several hundred, were Colonial Marines. And it was the Colonial Marines who were actually employed in setting fire to the White House. Coburn is very proud of this, and indeed this painting's made of him. He commissions it. It's after the war, and it's showing Washington, D.C. burning in the background. It's highly exaggerated in terms of the number of buildings being burned, but it just shows how proud Coburn was, that his greatest moment in his long and quite accomplished career was that he captured Washington, D.C. and burned the Capitol and the White House. Very proud of that. He really disliked Americans. Now, just to conclude, this is Gabriel Hunt. This is the only photograph we have of the several thousand former enslaved people who escaped to the British. He settles as a farmer in Nova Scotia. And this is a photograph that's taken in the early 1860s when he's quite an elderly man. He'd escaped when he was 15 years old in 1814. Lived a very long life, prospered as a farmer in Nova Scotia. And it's the only image that we have of any sort of any of these approximately 5,000 Americans who escaped and helped the British during the war, and then were resettled after the war, primarily in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, but also on the island of Trinidad. And they are resettled as free people who are given land. And then my final image here, and this is produced by an American who's a critic of slavery. It's produced after the War of 1812, shortly after it. And it shows the burned out Capitol building. But he's making a commentary here. And the commentary consists of what you see in the upper right-hand corner and the lower right corner. In the upper right-hand corner, you see celestial beings, angels, one with a liberty cap, and it shows them looking down on the scene. Meanwhile, immediately beneath them are enslaved people in rags and chains on their way to the deeper south to be sold. while a gentleman is both waving his hand at the Capitol building and looking back at the enslaved people. And so what Jesse Torrey, who created this image, is saying is that the destruction of the buildings associated with American freedom were something that was brought upon the Americans by their sin of slavery. Now, Jesse Torrey is not speaking for all Americans because, of course, thousands upon thousands of Americans continued to own slaves and to defend the enslaved system. And these people defending that system weren't all Southerners. There were many Northerners who said, we want the system to last because we don't want blacks to come north. But Jesse Torrey is representing a kind of emerging minority among Americans, saying that to perfect the American experiment in free government, it needs to be extended by eliminating slavery, beginning with the interstate slave trade. Now, Jesse Torrey would not in his own lifetime succeed in bringing about this revolution in American thinking that he was looking for, but he's a key player in starting a process that would have a very powerful impact on American life in the next generation. So that completes my presentation, and I'm very happy to take any questions that you may have.
All right. Let's see if we can take this to Facebook and see if anybody would like to comment on questions. Oh, someone had a question, but you already answered it. Oh, someone has apparently read The Internal Enemy already, and they are halfway through Thomas Jefferson's Education.
Okay, that's good.
So someone has a question about the enslaved who settled in Bermuda, and how that affected that colony. If you could possibly elaborate on that.
Yeah, several hundred during the war relocated to Bermuda, particularly to Bermuda is a cluster of islands, and one of the islands is called Ireland, and it's a British naval dockyard, so they're settled there. But it's a temporary settlement. After the war ends, and the war ends in early 1815 with the ratification of the peace treaty, that particular community at Bermuda was relocated to Nova Scotia. So there are enslaved people at Bermuda. Britain, while it was trying to free some African Americans, Britain was continuing to run a slave system at Bermuda and in the West Indies. The British would end up emancipating their enslaved people during the 1830s. But during the War of 1812, the British are in this contradictory position of maintaining their own slave system and of trying to disrupt the American economy by disrupting the slave system within the United States. Okay, you're muted, so I can't hear what you're saying.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
So I have a question. Was there any particular like strong ramifications of the large group of African Americans fleeing, and then, you know, stronger negative effects or regulations or restrictions put in place on the enslaved that were retained in the colonies?
Well, one thing that the United States does in the wake of the War of 1812, it starts to massively invest in building stronger fortification along the shores. And one of the major fortifications, Fortress Monroe, and down in Hampton, and then also at Norfolk. So the whole thing is to invest a lot of money to make it much more difficult for the British to ever come back into Chesapeake Bay again. And it also leads to the construction of major stone-built fortifications in all of the leading harbors of the United States, including what will become Fort Sumter and Charleston Harbor, and Fort Pulaski and Savannah. And there is, you know, while there isn't a massive slave revolt where slaves are killing masters and their families, something on a very small scale would happen in Southampton County with Nat Turners Revolt in the early 1830s. But the British, I mean, the Americans are very fearful, you know, that they like to believe that their slaves are reasonably happy and would not, in fact, run away. They have these divided consciousness. On one hand, they fear the internal enemy. On the other hand, they say, well, my slaves love me, though. And that gets shaken a bit by seeing thousands escape. So there is an effort to make slave patrols more effective. And if enslaved people are, particular enslaved people are perceived to be too resistant to the authority of masters and overseers, they are targeted for being sold to the Deep South. And so slavery will continue to expand territorially and in the number of enslaved people because through natural increase of people already here. And they will be shifted, thousands of them, that process of shifting them to the Deep South will continue. And the War of 1812 includes the conquest of a lot of additional Indian lands in what's now Alabama and Mississippi. And those places will really boom as cotton plantation development zones. And thousands upon thousands of Virginian and Maryland enslaved people will be relocated there after the War of 1812.
Got a question. How were the resettled people accepted in Nova Scotia?
Not particularly well by a lot of the white Nova Scotians. White Nova Scotians had participated in racism that seems to be pretty pervasive in 19th century Anglo-American world. And they said, well, why should we have to have these people as our neighbors? Why don't you take them somewhere else? But Nova Scotia was a handy place to bring them because there is a British naval base at Halifax. And there was actually a fair amount of underdeveloped land. And the land that's provided to them is pretty substandard in terms of the growing season's kind of short, the land's pretty rocky. And so a lot of them really struggle economically. But it's striking the number of them who struggle against this in this very difficult environment and against the local prejudice. And like Gabriel Hunt, actually managed to become reasonably prosperous. So it's most people, I think, we would say they remained poor, but they're free. And they're not at risk of their children or their spouse being suddenly wrenched away and sold somewhere else, or of being whipped for doing their work in the proper way. And their diet is better, their clothing's better. They're poor, but they're not in the terrible state that people in slavery, most people in slavery, were cast into.
We have another question. Someone asked, they see that the Colonial Marines remained active until 2016. And they're wondering if you could talk more about that final year in their demobilization process.
Well, they're demobilized in 1860. The Colonial Marines. Now, the Royal Marines have lasted much longer. The Colonial Marines were a special provincial unit, and they're demobilized in 1816. You're going to say, well, why weren't they demobilized right at the end of the war in 1815? Well, the British were hedging their bets. They thought, maybe this war is going to restart. We don't really trust the Americans. And it turns out these Colonial Marines are very effective, and they're very good at intimidating the Americans. So we're going to keep them as an active unit. And then in 1816, they decide, we think this peace will last, so we're going to demobilize the Colonial Marines. Now, the Colonial Marines and their families were not sent to Nova Scotia. Instead, they were sent to Trinidad and given lands there. And their descendants have a distinctive ethnic identity. They're called the Americans. So just drop the letter A in front of Americans and substitute a K for the C. They're called the Americans because they're people from America. And so I've met several of their descendants, and I recently was involved in a film project put on by the Trinidad National Archives to interview me and others about the history of this community. And you could make the case that it is the refugees who are relocated to Trinidad who have the best experience, in that they are in a society which does have slavery, but in which they are in a privileged position. And the great majority of people are people of color, and they have their own land. And so they're not dealing with a lot of white people who are looking for opportunities to exploit them, which you could say was the condition in Nova Scotia.
So we have another question asking if you talk more about the enslaved people who escaped and then return to free others.
Well, a fair number, when people escape and become Colonial Marines, or even if they just become guides or nurses or whatever, they will often try to lead raids back to where they're from in order to help their family members and their friends get away. So what tends to happen is you have an initial escape, which often will be young men, and then they will return leading British forces to try to enable much larger numbers of people, to entire families, to escape. So we have that phenomenon. Now, sometimes it goes awry, and sometimes people are captured, and they're then sold to the deeper south.
Looks like we have one last question. Someone asked if you thought about the general psychology of fear and perverse faith and their own slaves' loyalty in the period after Turner, and particularly from 1830 to 1860.
So I'm sorry to talk about the development of Southern thinking about slavery after 1830. Is that the question?
Yes.
Okay. During the 1830s and 40s, into the 1850s, you see the development of a cluster of beliefs that we've come to call pro-slavery. And we sometimes assume that those ideas go back to the colonial period. But one of the points I'm trying to make in The Internal Enemy is that the very idea about an internal enemy accepts as a premise that the relationship of masters to slaves is a state of war. And Thomas Jefferson is very eloquent about this. He's not saying that Thomas Jefferson and other leading Virginians of the Revolutionary era and even the early 19th century are not saying, usually, they're not saying, slaves are happy. Slavery is good for them. What they are saying is, slavery is a state of war, and we are exploiting these people, and they don't like it. And if they have an opportunity, they're going to try to get their freedom by running away or fighting us. So you then ask, why do they hang on to slavery then? If they think it's a state of war, it's dangerous. Well, Jefferson has a famous quote: "The slavery is like holding a wolf by the ears. The justice says you let the wolf go, but self-preservation says you hang on for dear life." And that's how Virginians thought about slavery during the early 19th century, during the time of the War of 1812. That keeping enslaved people was dangerous, it was exploitative, but they feared that if blacks became free, they would become even more dangerous. So Jefferson and others who had schemes for freeing enslaved people by the thousands, they were just proposals, no legislation ever happened. But Jefferson liked to play with this idea. And he said, but if we free them, we have to ship them all away, probably back to Africa. Well, most of these people have been born in Virginia. Their parents had been born in Virginia. Their grandparents had been born in Virginia. They didn't want to go to Africa, but Jefferson says it's not safe to have free people around in large numbers. So that's a cluster of thinking about slavery that's pretty uncomfortable, the notion that you're holding people and you're exploiting them and they're dangerous, but it's keeping them as slaves is just a bit safer than letting them be free, and we can't afford to ship them away. And so then by the 1830s and 40s, Southern leaders say, let's get rid of that cluster of ideas. But let's just say slavery's good for everybody and it's perpetual and they're happy and it's not a state of war. They're not the internal enemy. This is the best condition for African Americans is to be slaves. And it's that pro-slavery ideology that then locks Southerners into essentially a box. Well, the rest of the world, the Euro-American world, is moving slowly, painfully against slavery. And it's the Southern United States and Cuba and Brazil that are clinging to slavery. And with this conviction that you can't criticize our system's perfect. And so that's a very uncompromising position that emerges during the 1830s and 40s and 50s.
Well, one more question snuck in there. So they're wondering how the Colonial Marines of Virginia connect to the 1800 Gabriel's Rebellion and Nat Turner Rebellion of 1831.
Right. Well, Gabriel's rebellion or attempted rebellion was in and around Richmond. And it apparently involved hundreds and perhaps several thousand, but it goes awry because powerful thunderstorms come along and disrupt it at the critical moment. And a couple of dozen enslaved people were executed, including Gabriel. And several dozen more were transported to the Deep South. It's something that enslaved people throughout Virginia knew something about, and it is a powerful cautionary tale that organizing rebellion and pulling one off is going to be awfully difficult. Now, I can't prove this because we just don't have good evidence. But it's my assumption that the suppression, the bloody suppression of Gabriel's attempted revolt is something that leads enslaved people to say, rising up with hundreds of people in a slave revolt is too risky. It means that seeking freedom is going to be more effective if you can run away. Now, then we have Nat Turners Revolt, which in a way is the fulfillment of a long-standing nightmare of the internal enemy for white Virginians, that finally it's come true. But it's a pretty small group. I mean, the reason why Nat Turner is able to pull it off is that he keeps the core group small, less than a dozen men. And then the goal is to strike and kill as many people as possible and then gain recruits at their farms of enslaved people. But it turns out it ultimately collapses, again, because the militia comes in and it just suppresses it very effectively. So I would say Nat Turner's Revolt is an exceptional moment. There's nothing else like it. But it's something that haunts Virginians thereafter. So it has an impact that is disproportionate to the scale at which Nat Turner's Revolt happened. But it tends to reinforce Virginians in a very strict surveillance regime. So it becomes, after that, it becomes illegal to teach a slave to read. It was not illegal before. It was discouraged, and nobody was allowed to set up a school, but if an individual master taught slaves to read, or members of the family did it, or some slaves taught others to read, you know, it's not exactly encouraged, but it wasn't suppressed by law the way it is after Nat Turner's Revolt.
Well, thank you so much for answering all those questions.
Happy to.
All righty. Well, I guess we'll just go ahead and wrap things up because we are at our time. But thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm going to close out now.
Okay, thank you very much for your help.